All right, for lecture 4.2, I want to share some examples of culturally competent research. Same module level outcomes as last time. And both of these are going to be community-based participatory research, which I teased in the last lecture. This is defined as a collaborative research approach that equitably involves community members, researchers, and other stakeholders in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each bring. And so I'm going to provide you with two examples, one that uses youth in a community-based partnership to improve middle school lunch options, and another that engages an Indigenous community with an end-of-life study using previously collected data. So this first one is Stephanie Reich, Joseph Kay, and Grace Lynn, called Nourishing a Partnership to Improve Middle School Lunch Options. And just highlighted a few important things. First, that they were engaging with youth, which is rarely done. We talk in ethics about how youth are a vulnerable group, particularly, and how there are different challenges associated with it. But the goal of this CVPAR project was to design and address a particular issue in this middle school. And so they had some graduate students and a professor engage with a local middle school to address different issues affecting the students. And the administrators of the school selected 14 student leaders who would be the student researchers on this project. They started by defining the problem. So importantly, I think these researchers didn't come into the school and say, "Hey, we want to tackle food insecurity or satisfaction with school lunches." Rather, they did brainstorming sessions with the youth, and they had identified several issues, but eventually landed on the quality of food served in lunch. And so this is where they started, and they had these recurring meetings with the students, letting the students sort of lead the process. So one of the first things the students noted was, hey, like if we want to change student lunch, one of the things we need to know is like how student lunch works. So they worked on collecting different evidence. So, if you read through this in full, you see how the researchers sort of gently help provide their research expertise while also letting the students sort of stumble at times. So, they were trying to figure out how are we going to collect evidence that shows that like students really don't like these lunches. They were like, we know this, but what's the evidence that suggests it? So they created a form where they did participant observation, creating a form where they tallied how often students were throwing away lunches. And then, they were like, oh, we could like interview people. But at first they were like, don't you think it's gross? Like, don't you think this food is gross? Whereas then they learned how to have more open-ended questions. And then this sort of data collection led them to realize we need to go talk to some key informants, like the lunch ladies and the head of the food services. So then they went and they talked to Hector Jimenez, who is the head of their food services and their staff. They used this to help revise the problem definition and developed a clear definition, and then decided they wanted to start a survey. And so again, went through a survey writing workshop and the researchers were able to help the students kind of develop that survey item, collect and analyze the data. They obtained 44% of the student body, which is like way better response rate than most researchers actually get. And then we're able to obtain survey data. So 44% got school lunch every day. They got lunch 3.7 times a week. That's less than half. Talking about the different food that people are eating. And then they found that many students were not consuming lunch daily. Some lunches were more desirable than others and wanted to share this with the administration. So they created a PowerPoint presentation focusing on their survey data, And the district was actually really receptive to it. They wanted the copy of the PowerPoint and a copy of their full survey results so that they could, do something about it. So I think another important thing is with this research, it's not always a manuscript or a conference presentation that's going to come out of it, which is like traditional in academia. It could be more like, a report or a PowerPoint like this, which is going to be able to affect actionable change. So I'll share this article in case you want to read the full thing. But I also just wanted to highlight this one about Nothing About Us Without Us, how community-based participatory research methods were adapted in an Indigenous end-of-life study using previously collected data. And so in this one, there were actually Indigenous researchers who recognized that if you were going to study end-of-life care in Indigenous people, that really you should be engaging with Indigenous organizations. And this is a timeline of engagement. You can see it lasted almost a year from initial engagement to ethics approval. So as I mentioned in the last lecture, this community engaged approach can take quite a long time because you're working back and forth, you're being thoughtful about the decisions that you're making. You can see they took a great deal of time establishing guiding principles to underpin the research. They used this Indigenous principle of two-eyed seeing that guided how they would work together, recognizing the importance of both cultures, Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. They agreed to objectives and research questions. They had long discussions about how to interpret the data. So having these really robust and thoughtful conversations about every step of the research process collaboratively in partnership was a real important process here. And they said that they built their partnership around principles of respect, relevance, reciprocity, and mutual responsibility. And one of the examples they gave was recognizing the unique skills that each person brought to the project. And they really highlighted the importance of partnering with that Indigenous organization, especially analyzing already collected data. So, doing so and working with this organization, they were able to pose important research questions that could uncover how home care services in places of death for Indigenous people differ from the services provided for non-Indigenous people. And they talk about how that lens was super important and they possibly couldn't have done that otherwise. Um, and so they say it's essential that the research and outcomes are always reflective of Indigenous needs and challenges and how sort of ignorant it would be if you were to do this sort of secondary data without the um, input of the community that you're working with. So that was like a very fast review of what's been going on here. I'm gonna upload these sorry, not lectures, these articles. I'll keep the highlights on them if that's helpful, so you can kind of see the pieces that I thought were important. And then we'll submit a reflection because both of these were community-based participatory projects, but I want to recognize that you saw how long and intensive that was. That's not always possible. So, in our culturally competent research reflection, we'll think about ways outside of community-based participatory research you might be able to engage in a culturally competent manner. So, we'll see you then, and then we'll see you next week.